All right, everyone, we'll get rolling. And first of all, I'd like to thank everyone for your patience in the weather. I know it was a little tricky this morning, I know, especially for the folks up west that are traveling in. So thank you. Do we have a motion for the adoption of the agenda? Jamie? Shall carry?
Carry.
All right, and we're going to jump right into it because we only have until about 1 o'clock because AV needs time to switch over before the 1:30 meeting this afternoon. So welcome our guests here today, and just before you do speak, if you could just introduce yourself for Hansard. All right, so the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Brad Caldwell, Deputy Minister, Environment, Water and Climate Change. I'd like to thank the committee for allowing us to come and speak to the regulations for the sewage disposal systems in the water withdrawal. Given the interest of time, we do have most of the focus of our presentations on the water withdrawal. The sewage disposal, very quickly, is a set of regulations that deal with the licensing, contracting, setbacks, requirements of sewage disposal systems. It was updated recently within the last 2 years, and in order for the Water Act to function, they need to be slid over from the Environmental Protection Act to the Water Act, so we don't see any substantial change for that. So the focus of our presentation will be on the water withdrawal. And today we'll walk you through a bit of an overview on our water supply here in Prince Edward Island. It's calculated in our department. A bit of a background on the Water Act, and Bruce will walk us through some of the details on the draft regulations that were provided for consultation back last summer, and I'll walk the committee through what we heard in some of our consultations. So I'm going to turn it over to George.
Okay, thank you. I guess since we're talking about water withdrawal, it makes sense to describe a little bit about what we're withdrawing from, what the resource looks like. So as we sort of mentioned through our sort of lead up to the consultation, we do actually have quite a bit of water, and just some figures up on the slide there, but essentially we get a lot of precipitation in eastern Canada to start with, and a pretty high proportion that does soak into the ground to provide recharge to our groundwater resources. So we do have abundant water, sort of, if you look at it in a global sense or a wide sense. The other thing is that our groundwater resources are critical in maintaining stream flow in our aquatic habitat. So when we look at how we manage water, we reserve 65% of it to maintain those ecological functions. And so we actually would only permit, on an island-wide basis, 35% to be actually allocated through permits. In fact, only about 1.5% is used. So looking at how we use it, it's also important just in terms of perspective when we look at various sort of issues related to water withdrawal, that by far the most important use is for residential. And this is something we've tried to enshrine in the Water Act itself, make that a priority, that access to water for human use is paramount. It certainly supports a lot of our industrial activity as well. It's in the last 10 or 15 years become an important renewable energy source also through geothermal installations. And it supports the agriculture industry largely at this point through livestock made to drink, and then to a more limited extent through irrigation. And the table up there, you can, just to give you a sense of how we actually dip into our water resources, you can see that even for our largest water use residential, it's a little less than 1% of the amount of recharge we get to our groundwater resources. If you look at industrial activities, which would include commercial activities as well, about 0.75%. So fairly modest use compared to how much is available in the first place. So just before you hit next, I was just going to mention, so you can see from this slide though, that certainly it's a really essential, I'll use the term resource, but entity if you will. So it is sort of precious, as we like to say, but it's not scarce. Okay. So having said that, this is one of the important things. Groundwater and surface water both are constrained on a more local scale by the watershed boundaries in which the system exists. There are numerous watersheds, and certainly the extraction of groundwater or use of surface water is not evenly distributed. So while we do have lots of water in total, there are certain areas where it's more important to manage it very carefully, because we certainly use a disproportionate amount in some watersheds compared to others. Certainly the Wind River would be a key example of that sort of thing. So all that to say that we do have lots of water. It's a very important resource to us. It's something very close to Islanders. But having said that we've got lots of it, it's still important to manage it carefully. So just sort of the regulatory sort of context for the regulations we'll be talking about, we'll just go through a little bit about the Water Act. So certainly an important milestone in the management of water and PEI. We did manage it, continue to manage it under existing regulations, but this is the first time we've actually singled out a specific act focusing on water alone. It also clears up or clarifies a few things, so it clearly identifies government's role in managing and protecting water resources. It certainly reflects the connection Islanders have with water resources. And in developing the Act, we certainly talked to the public and got a lot of information and a lot of feedback from them in terms of what was important to them. And we tried to use that to guide our drafting of the Act itself. So the Act received royal assent in December of 2017. A couple of the key sort of things, it recognizes that water's there for our common good as Islanders as a whole, not for any one sector or person or whatever. It tries to stress a balance between human needs and ecological well-being as well. It tries to stress the importance of making decisions based on facts, evidence-based decision-making, and also to make decisions that are transparent and that the government's accountable for the decisions it makes. A large part of it is incorporating elements from the Environmental Protection Act. So it's important to realize that it's not that we didn't manage water before, but we did it under an act with a whole bunch of other considerations as well. So a large part of what we will be looking at comes from existing legislation. There are some new provisions. Certainly one of the key ones is Section 2, which looks at sort of the guiding principles, or sort of the spirit of the Act, if you will, which is intended to provide some guidance on the more intangible sort of things that might come up, or provide guidance in future decisions which aren't anticipated in the current legislation. And the other big thing that we've tried to inject into it is, rather than just a set of rules as to how we use and manage water, is a function or enabling a process where we can plan for future water use. So water management planning areas is a key part of it as well. So in terms of implementing the Act itself really just says what government intends to do, and hopefully with the Section 2 part provides sort of the philosophical outlook we have in terms of how we want to do those things. But the regulations, one of which we're talking about today, is how we're actually going to implement those things. So the direction in terms of what we want to accomplish really was done through the Act. This is how we intend to live up to those goals. And to proclaim the Act, there are, just because of the way it's structured and the way previous legislation was, 4 key regulations that need to be in place. One's the well construction regulations. So formerly they were the water well regulations, but now they don't include the water withdrawal. That's what we're talking about today. The water supply and wastewater treatment system regulations, which are really an update of existing regulations we had. Water withdrawal regulations we're talking about today, and the sewage disposal system regulations, which Brad referred to, where really we've updated the language to fit under the enabling features of the Water Act as opposed to the Environmental Protection Act, but functionally there's no difference in how they actually operate. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bruce, I believe.
Yes, Bruce Raymond, manager of the Water and Air Monitoring Section for the department. So as the quick title slide flew by there, this is the Consultation Draft. So this is the material that was released last summer, and this is the material that the consultations with the public were getting their feedback on as to whether we had captured the kinds of things that they were telling us during the consultation for the Act itself, when it comes down to the in-the-weeds details of how we're going to actually manage these. So for highlights, we're good now. The first thing is that this combines the 2 different ways that we manage water presently. Groundwater is managed under one set of regulations under the EPA, and surface water is managed under a different set of regulations under the EPA. This combines them into one, provides a similar approval process and criteria for them, and really kind of ensures that the consideration of usage is fully and more seamlessly merged together as it is all one resource. Now, currently, approval is needed when you exceed 4 liters per second. That works out to 350 cubic meters a day. That is being dropped under these regulations, and this is due to the piece that's in the Act. The Act is already lowered that criteria to 25 cubic meters per day, quite a bit lower, and in line with some of the most progressive legislation in the country. So we're now, instead of having a higher value than other places, we're now in line with other places. And it makes sense. You'll notice that we've also changed from per second to per day. And the reason for that is that when you're talking extraction from groundwater, the instantaneous amount of water that you're taking out isn't as important as the average that you're taking out. So by picking up per day time frame, that allows for higher usage rates over very short periods of times that don't have any more or greater impact than lower usage rates. Because of these lower rates that are now being captured and will require permits, they have a less of an impact on the environment. So as a result, they are not going to need as much of an assessment when an applicant comes in the door and looks for an approval. So as you can see up there, the way it's structured is that if you're less than 25 cubic meters a day, as you would with a domestic well, and by the way, a domestic household of 5 people might use 1 cubic meter a day. So 25 cubic meters is way in excess of what any household would use. They don't need any kind of permit. They would just continue on hiring a licensed well driller like they do today, and that would be the end of it. For those users who are going to now have the greater than 25 cubic meters, there'll be a desktop assessment and they'll get a permit. The process for high capacity wells is essentially unchanged in that there will be an exploration permit and then an extraction permit. There'll be a new name, of course, under these regs. If we could flip to the next one there. So, other things that are important, there are some activities that we do that really don't require an approval. Some of those we don't want to have an approval for emergency fire suppressant. We absolutely don't want to hinder putting a fire out. But there's some other things, such as the occasional filling of mobile tanks and swimming pools. Mobile tanks, you can think of tanks there that are in trucks to suppress dust on roads or for the application of crop protectants in the agricultural sector. In occasion, there are diversion of water for construction purposes, and there's no permit required under these regs for that. However, it's still controlled by the regulations, the water withdrawal, the water and wetland protection regulations under the Environmental Protection Act. That control is still there. So while it's exempted from here, it's not that they get to do what they want. It's just that it makes more sense to have diversions controlled by the permit that would be related to that water act, the stream or wetland itself, that change, all in one place. So another key component is that we've been seeing, and I'm sure you're keenly aware, in the last few years, there's been a trend towards putting multiple low-capacity wells together to obtain water. And it's important to know that when you have multiple low-capacity wells together, they have an impact that's similar to a single higher-capacity well. So another key component of the regulations is the piece that requires that multiple low-capacity wells be considered as one. They get assessment as one, and so they're properly assessed for their total and real impact on the environment. As I said before, the high-capacity wells still require a groundwater exploration permit. And the changes, though, are going to be more in the considerations. We've always looked at a number of considerations in protection for the environment, but now some of those are going to be enshrined as considerations right in the regulations that are required to be looked at. You'll note that the moratorium on new high-capacity wells for agricultural irrigation is explicitly right in the regulations. And also, as a general theme for these approvals for the high capacity and low capacity wells, approvals for them are valid for 5 years. This differs from the current process where we issue permits with no expiry. One of the important things for that is that that provides for a review of those wells and the extraction every 5 years to determine whether or not it still makes sense with respect to impacts on the environment and government policy on water management. The detailed considerations for withdrawal, as I said, we've always had a number of things that we look at with withdrawals, but now we're explicitly going to be looking at the cumulative withdrawals in watershed and the impact and maintenance on existing permits, the impact on stream flow and aquatic habitat. Those both have always been looked at by policy, but now they're required by the regulation. And the new piece is the consistency with the water management plans and policy goals. The water management plans are the piece of the Act, Section 4 of the Act, where we later on will be looking at creating water management plans. These are not part of this process, but when permits are issued here, when those come into play at a future date, permits issued here have to be done in conjunction and mesh with what those plans come to pass. There's priorities occasionally having to be taken. They're only needed when there's not enough water in a watershed for all of the needs. When those are happening now, the top priority will be for fire suppression. Fire suppression is a very intermittent, more intermittent than perhaps any use, and so it really doesn't have a great impact on other water uses. The next highest priority is domestic use, and that includes both private wells and municipal supplies. It doesn't include the industrial use through a municipal supply. There has been some confusion by the public on that. So a municipal supply has both industrial and domestic. The priority is on the domestic part of that use. And then thirdly, commercial, industrial uses of water, and also potentially to the degree on which they serve the public interest. And that's one for me. So what are the implications? It provides a single regulatory regime for a single resource. It articulates in regulation some of these things that we have always looked at by policy, but now they're required as part of the regulation. It articulates that we are to keep a mind towards water conservation. The scope of users requiring approval is greater because of that lower criteria. And as a result, those users, there'll be more users of water who will have to report to government what their usages are, and will be able to reveal in a transparent fashion to the public what that use is, and that will happen on the Water Registry. That's part and parcel of the Water Act when it comes into play. And then lastly, the fixed duration of the approvals ensures that review. That review is important to do because as science changes, then we're able to react and adjust permits and usage accordingly. So that's it for the overview of the regulations that were in the consultation version that were released last summer. And I'll turn it over to the Deputy Colwell to move on to what the consultation should.
Can I ask you maybe just to clarify one thing on slide 14 here, and that's about the monitoring that we currently do of our waterways and our water. You know, even though we may not have water users reporting data themselves, we're doing the monitoring of our waterways, for example.
Yes, we monitor the water in streams to make sure that the flow doesn't go below an acceptable environmental level. And we also utilize that to, in some cases, turn certain surface water permits off. In addition to that, we do know, we have estimates of the amount of water that's being utilized on PEI, and we're able to do that through knowledge of what typical systems use, the kinds of wells that are out there. While we don't require specific water reporting of some of those lower uses now, we do know that the wells exist, that the well drillers are required and have been for decades. They send us records of the wells that they drill. And so we find out about these wells and what they're utilized for, and we actually have that information online now, and anyone can go and obtain it. So
this is going to fill in the picture more with.
it gives us
The water
greater
usage.
detail on that water usage information. Doesn't necessarily tell us about usage that we're unaware of.
Right. Great. Thank you for clarifying that.
That's great. Thanks, Bruce, Minister, too, for that question. So as Bruce mentioned and walked through, the highlights of the consultation draft that was provided to this committee, after providing to the committee, we went out and accepted, of course, submissions online and hit the street as well to hear what people have to say. And with the timing of this presentation here, we have the benefit of being able to share what we heard and to have that help inform the conversation today. I do have handouts, sorry, I should have gave these prior. Sean, is this something you can give me a hand with? Thank you so much. I should have put those on the desk. So while Sean's handing those out, I'll give a bit of a background. So the consultation draft that Bruce spoke about was put online in July to give a bit of a background on, or to allow people to comment on what we had, what we have presented, and to see where everyone stands on it. We received responses directly to that. Those responses are available online. Many of them were submitted through the online portal. Some were provided hard copies. We did a double check there this week to make sure we have them all up there. We believe they are, and certainly we'll do a triple check when we get back to the office as well to make sure that every response we've received is there. And in addition to receiving information through the traditional let us know what you think, we did conduct some in-person sessions that were more interactive in Summerside, O'Leary, Pools Corner, and Charlottetown. As well, for those who couldn't make it, we offered the opportunity to answer the key questions we were asking through an online survey. And given that we had the benefit of the significant consultations that happened during the Water Act, which helped inform the draft of the regulations Bruce spoke about, and given how, as George mentioned, these are more about the how, we were able to fine-tune the questions to really help us guide whether what we had drafted is what people feel is appropriate. And the format of our consultations, as you'll see in this document, in addition to gathering people's opinion on what the question asks, whether they agree or disagree, or they're somewhere in that spectrum in between. Subsequent to that exercise, we also requested the participants to sit down with groups of 4 to specifically talk about what they had, what they feel in terms of that question, and to take that deeper dive into it. As some of the topics that are addressed in this are divisive, and there's certainly mixed opinions on it, and certainly through the consultation and having that format where you could have the diverse opinions sit down in that civil setting to discuss, and try to come up with any consensus that they have on the topic was really helpful to us, certainly with seeing the impact of it, but we also felt it was quite valuable in terms of getting people's opinions across about how they feel on the particular topic. Sometimes whether there was a consensus or not, at least the conversation took place. So the document you have talks about the 8 key questions we asked. I'll walk through them very quickly. And what the response was, and then I'll talk into some of the topics we heard during the submissions. So the first question we asked is, do you agree that high-capacity wells should have a more detailed assessment than low-capacity wells? As Bruce noted earlier there, where you saw the table, there's the new category of the low-capacity wells, which weren't covered before. With the draft regulations, there's it's certainly embedded that there'd be more rigor on those high capacity wells. So we did ask this question. The answer in front of you, where the majority seem to agree that there should be more assessment. Some of the themes that came across was, of course, talking about the need for more rigor. And George mentioned in where our water is being used, he talked about municipal being one of the largest sources, and there was some comments that just to not lose sight of that. Notation that some low capacity wells may require more scrutiny, and that's something that could come to light in the desktop assessment. And certainly, as is intended, and it's important to be reminded to make sure you focus on the impact on the watershed where it's in place. The second question, we had since we had the captive audience of those who were participating, we took it as an opportunity to ask the question of where those who were at the session, where they stand in terms of the moratorium. Presented some information on its background, its the moratorium being in place for agriculture, irrigation, and some other examples of where high capacity wells are allowed currently. So we asked the question: do you agree that the high capacity wells should be prohibited for agriculture while available for other industries? As you can see in the pie chart, it's a fairly split answer, where 50% disagreed. And some of the comments, as are noted in the documents, I won't read them verbatim. Spoke to the different treatment of industries, the need for environmental assessments. Not just in this question, but throughout, came out as being a very critical piece. The restriction of non-essential services and the need for continuous monitoring, in addition to other comments noted as well. Third question we asked, first we outlined, as Bruce noted, the requirement to consider both stream and aquatic life when the ministers considering the ministry's considering the permit. You see the question yielded a fairly favorable response in terms of agreement that those should be considered, which wasn't surprising. Some of the themes that came across, and this is one that certainly, if you're to review the written submissions that are on our website, you'll see came across quite a bit as well, where there was some concerns that the language may lean more towards the word may when perhaps the word shall could be there, that subjectivity. So that came across quite a bit. And while that could be one where the intent was that would be followed, it certainly was important to get that reminder that perhaps has to be a little more explicit. Again, a common theme was the importance of evidence-based and science-based information, and of course the monitoring being made public, which is something was addressed earlier. Fourth question, we gave a quick outline of the expected fees, the online application, and the departmental assessment for those who were participating. Asked the question: do you agree with the process outlined for the approval of low capacity wells? The majority seemed to be in favor of that. So the themes we saw was the importance of defining conditions. We did receive the comment. What we presented seemed to be a little vague, which was important feedback for us, and that's reflected there as well. and that these application fees, what should we do with them, and how would they be reinvested? Some spoke of reinvestment for environmental initiatives. Others were cognizant of the appropriate resourcing for monitoring something as significant as the Water Act. The fifth question, as Bruce mentioned earlier, in the draft regulations, you see the treatment of multiple low-capacity wells operating together, where they have the same effect as a high-capacity well, that they should be treated as a high-capacity well. We asked the question that's in front of you of whether the participants felt that was appropriate, and the answer was yes, that if you do have the multiple low-capacity wells, they should be treated accordingly. The consensus really spoke to that general agreement, and really reiterated the need to focus on volumes. The sixth question we ask, which is fairly self-explanatory, whether the permits for groundwater, they currently do not expire, and is there agreement with a 5-year renewal process when meeting environmental conditions? And that last part is important, where if there is a situation where the permit would not be meeting environmental conditions, they would be subject to different scrutiny. However, for those that are, is 5-year appropriate. While 58% agree, and there were some comments that while it's good to have renewal, some suggested that is 5 years the appropriate number. Some suggested perhaps lower. And something that came to light in this question and really came across in some other responses as well, specific responses to our draft, was the need or the plan for years where there's drip. And while that's one where we may have felt that was implicit in what was drafted as in the Act and regulations, it was a reminder that sometimes it needs to be explicitly stated like that. So that's came across in this question. The seventh question, we have spoke to the holding ponds that were constructed prior to this period of time. These ponds would have been constructed during a time where they weren't prohibited by any regulations. Certainly that there was a significant expense that was attached to their construction. And in fact, provincially there was guidelines that were published on how to best construct these. With the Water Act, there's a 5-year transition period for any existing supply of water or any piece that would now be subject under different scrutiny under the Water Act to get in line. So we did ask the question to the participants, because we felt this was very important to ask, do you think that the existing legally constructed wells that supply holding ponds should be grandfathered in? As you can see, it was a split response. There was more that said they agree than disagree, but it certainly it was divided. Some of the themes that came across spoke to the importance of if there is a movement towards grandfathering, that there be appropriate control that's put on, and some comments that if they were subject to the regular regulations, then perhaps could be some additional control. You'll note the idea of compensations raised, routine inspections, and just some of the general concerns that were surrounding this topic leading into it. The eighth question, which we provided detail on the fees and asked the question that there are no fees for permits for groundwater right now, but there are fees for the withdrawal of surface water. And do you, the participants, agree that fees should be for permits for groundwater? And it's a question where more certainly agreed with it than not. It was fairly split, but again, some of the themes talked about if there are fees being charged for it, what are those fees being used for? And some of it spoke to the potentially reinvesting it, while recognizing the additional burden that can be placed on administering items like this. As well, there was the idea of volume-based as well. So that was the in-person and the online survey. The 200 plus participants we had participate in that, both online and in person. And again, thank you to anyone who showed up and helped with that. So in addition to that, we offered the opportunity to provide submissions, of what you as an individual or a group felt about the draft regulations that were put out for consultation. We received near 30 of them since June when they were released, and it was a mixture of sometimes the response was received, and if there was a request to sit down with us and chat with us on what the group's feelings are on the regulations, we certainly offer that up. And again, thank you to any group who offered their time and in some cases offered a lot of time to help us out in determining what's appropriate as we go forward. And sometimes the content, more so on the online piece, would be outside of the scope of these regulations specifically when we get into land planning and other areas like that. But much of it was well guided, and certainly if you look online, there's a significant page with lots of comment. And given the large amount of responses we've received and the depth of which they contained. I'll touch on a few of the themes or significant pieces that came to light, recognizing that this may not be all-encompassing. As I noted before, there was a piece we heard quite often was on the language, definitive language, in certain sections. A lot of that focused on the choice of the word may versus shall, and what the impact of that is, and whether that is something that can be revised. So that was a recurring theme that came up quite a bit. Conservation was a word that didn't really appear in there, and again, much like the drought piece, where it may have been thought of as being implicit. There were certainly some requests to make sure that was explicitly stated, where the language would refer to managing water, perhaps not necessarily mentioning the importance of conserving water as well. The use of the precautionary principle is a piece that came up certainly quite a bit. I know I wasn't with the department during the Water Act consultations, but it was a term that came quite frequently, and of course appeared during these consultations as well, and the importance of taking that caution and pausing and reviewing until more information is provided by times. And the last few points before I open it to the committee for their thoughts of what we heard. Drought considerations and contingency plans, again, did come up quite a bit. I know I talked about that earlier, but that was one that not just in the in-person meetings, but also came up in the submissions as well. The need for ongoing public input, and certainly the Water Act itself that has the clause that requires any piece of regulation to go before the standing committee for discussion before it's put in place. It ensures that to a certain degree, but there seemed to be interest in beyond that as well. Not surprising, given the answer that was presented in the in-person. There was many people who made the case for, and many people who made the case against the prohibition of new high-capacity wells for agricultural irrigation. The moratorium generated quite a bit of conversation. And the last two pieces, the Federation of Agriculture, really spoke to on while in their written submission spoke about while they spoke about their objection and their stated stance against the moratorium, raised the question that even if were opposed to it. They proposed that there should be at least a provision to allow for research with the intent of gathering evidence for evidence-based decisions. And in the response, they laid out that they felt that the current regulations that was missing within there. Sorry, the last piece that I'll talk about, I talked about it in the previous question, but did come up as a theme throughout the submissions was on the holding ponds that were constructed during a time where there was no regulation that or a law that would stop them, whether it would be appropriate to grandfather those that were in place, and of course have the appropriate scrutiny there on them as renewals are required. But it was something that was raised throughout, and it's quite a long spiel on the consultations. But so I guess as part of that requirement to bring before the standing committee, we're quite curious of what the thoughts are from the standing committee, both on the on the drafts that were provided and the overview of what we heard through the consultation.
Well, thank you. And I guess we'll jump right into questions. And Jamie, you would wave me down there earlier. You're up. Jamie?
Thank you. Can we go back to, first of all, I guess, thank you very much for the work you have done on this. I know it's not a topic that's very dear and true to a lot of people's hearts in the province of Prince Edward Island. And as some people say, we don't have a lot of resources on the island. But, water is definitely one of our most important resources we have going forward, and the managing of that resource is very important. Can we go back to the slide which broke down, I think it said something about 0.4% in regards to water that's being used for agricultural purposes?
Sure. Forgive me here, I'm not as tech savvy as I should be. Oh, that didn't help at all, I'm sorry. We'll get there in a second, I apologize for this. Scroll up. I believe it was right here? Yes.
Yeah, so according to what I'm seeing there is currently we're only using 0.04% for irrigation or agricultural purposes. Can you expand on that as it relates to the other numbers?
Yeah, so the column on the right, Minister, would be taking what was in the on the left-hand pie chart of we have the breakdown of the groundwater that's used, and actually may even help to revisit the pie chart here where when George walked us through what the annual recharge is. And there's that red section there of what is reserved for environmental flows. You have the blue piece here would be the water that's used, approximating 1.5% of that annual recharge. So what you see here is this level of the 1.5 reflected here in how groundwater is used, and taking that piece as a percentage of the full recharge that exists on this slide. George, anything to supplement there?
No, I think that's essentially it. So of the total recharge we use collectively, with all uses, about 2%, rough round figures, and of the total amount of water we use, about 2% of that, or 1.5% or whatever, is used for irrigation. So it's 1.5% or 1.5% or 2% of 2% or something like that. So the total withdrawal of water in general is 2%, and of that 2%, only about 2% is used for irrigation.
Okay, thank you. What other industrial uses are that industrial there of the 0.72, can you break that down into what that would encompass, or what industries?
It would be any industry that's using enough water that they require a high capacity well and therefore a permit. So that would, as well, it would also include all industries that are connected to a municipal system. might be using small amounts of water, but are part of a larger non-residential amount, if you will. And so the ones that are connected to municipal supplies, that could be any non-residential activity. And the ones that are not connected to municipal supplies, it's just the ones that have enough water usage that they would require those permits. And you can imagine any kind of activity, whether it's from our largest industry of Cavendish farms to our fish plants, to aquaculture facilities. You're probably not going to see car washes there, simply because they use an awful lot less water than what people think they use. It's just simply on volume.
Jamie?
Okay, thank you. How much have you actually involved industry in these conversations or this consultation? I'm talking industry on a broad sense at first.
It's a good question, Minister. Of course, it would be anyone was free to respond and attend any of the sessions. So in that sense, it would be open for that piece. Of course, on the broadest of broad sense, I mean, there were certain industries that were more interested than others, but we didn't actively seek out any industries beyond those that expressed interest in providing content.
Jamie?
So should we not be engaging industry more broadly, or having conversations with them on what their usage is and next best steps, practices going forward?
Yeah, it could be. I mean, there were certainly some industries that had a greater interest in this, and the idea of making sure everyone's heard is fair, for sure.
Jeremy?
I might just add, if I could briefly, that for instance, we certainly thought the tourism sector would be interested, so we did communicate through tourism about that. We've not heard anything back in terms of interest from them. We also supplied these things to MCPEI as well, have not heard anything back from them. For some of the other sectors, there's no sort of central organization which would sort of tie them together. So as Brad mentioned, I mean, these things were, have been out for a consultation for some time, and so that there's no specific sort of targeting of, car washes versus restaurants or things like that. Well, I guess actually restaurants, the tourism sector would have been the approach, but there's a bit of a challenge in terms of recognizing a body with which you can carry on a discussion with, in contrast to, say, something like the Federation of Agriculture, where there is some sort of organized sort of opportunity for feedback.
So what I'm wondering, I guess, is residential take out of the equation, take germothermal heat out of the equation, and livestock. And if we look at industrial and irrigation or agricultural purposes, I'm wondering if we should not be actually reaching out and engaging with them industries to get their input on where they're going or what their needs could be for the future, and how they might be, looking at new best practices that are coming out
Right.
on that. So I'm wondering, would that be a good next step practice going forward, or is that something this committee should be recommending?
Yeah, it's certainly a good idea. I mean, there would be, as Bruce mentioned, those who would be representing that volume there would be those that are the highest users, right? So between seafood processors and other groups like that, I think there could be some merit in that for sure.
Jamie?
Okay, just to follow up on that, and I just come to mind, when we're talking about, through your surveys, I think it was 205 to 206 people at the most that, did we break down that number to see who actually that broke down to actually who these people were or what they, yeah?
No, that would be, when people came in, one individual was given the set of dots, so we didn't collect the characteristics of who would be responding on each side. So those numbers would represent individuals who are participating, some of which just anecdotally I know would be involved in industry who were involved there, but it's not that precise, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you for now.
Rob?
Yeah, I guess in one of your presentations, or the slides there, you mentioned about eventually going with a groundwater exploration permit. What would be some of the considerations that you would take into account to, say, issue a permit? Like, is there a sort of a weighted factor of, each watershed would be a little different, I'm assuming, and things like that. But I just want to get some sense of what you'd be looking at considering before you issued a permit.
So there's a large sort of body of knowledge of our hydrogeologist, and when he's getting an application coming in, he's assessing that against that body of knowledge. So he's looking at how much other water is already being utilized in the watershed, what the environmental limits might be in that watershed, and whether there's a reasonable likelihood that the well will be successful. Also, whether or not all of the restrictions on well construction appear to not be any impediments. I'm probably missing some, but that's where the kinds of things he's looking at. He's looking at immediate, the closest wells, because it's really important that new wells not adversely affect existing wells. And so those kinds of things are what he's looking at. Now, buried in amongst that is that when he's looking at the availability of water from an environmental perspective, that is the tip of a previous piece of work, looking at how much water needs to be there. So by doing it in that fashion, that larger assessment of the environment actually ends up reflecting on every single permit and whether or not it makes sense to issue that or not. Now, the other thing to remember is that groundwater is kind of easy to get from PEI relative to other places. And often we forget that just because you drill a hole and you're usually successful in PEI, it's not always the case. And so the key word in there, in that permit of exploration, that is part and parcel what that permit is all about. And so whether it makes sense to explore in that area for water and have that come back as information to the department is part of that consideration of issuing that permit.
Yes, Brad Rivers here. So I just wanted to make sure we clarify when it comes to a groundwater exploration permit, in the context, are they required today or is this something new? I think.
Right, so there's two good, that point and also one other that leads me to. They are required today. It's an existing process for high capacity wells, and we're not proposing changing the limit on that. And what I mean is that existing high capacity wells have to get that exploration permit. Low capacity wells have no permitting requirements at all today. Under the new regulations, you'll still get the exploration permit for the high capacity wells. The low capacity wells, you'll need to get a withdrawal permit, but you won't have to get an exploration permit. Now, the other piece is that exploration permit doesn't give you the ability to use the well and withdraw the water afterwards. You have to get a second permit for that. It truly is exploration to see if it's feasible. That information that comes back from that exploration could transpire to tell us that either A, the water's not available, or that it has an impact that is in excess of what we would allow, and we might not end up issuing a withdrawal permit, and they could just not get a well out of the process.
Rob?
So how much of a factor do you put in? So if a certain watershed has the potential of a certain amount of capacity to extract water. How much does the use of that come into play? I mean, so I'm getting your permits based a lot on the availability of the resource and the impacts it might have on the environment. But when we talk about the use, so whether it's an industrial use or whether it's a geothermal heat use or for the production of food, how do you weight that as far as figuring it out? So in other words, there may be 50 wells being allowed in a certain watershed, and the first bunch of them are all industrial uses, and then there's no more use for, say, for the production of food or for other potential uses. I guess is where I'm trying to get a sense. How do you figure that out?
So we do make a priority for domestic use, but generally, with respect to industrial use, it's first come, first served. So if you have a watershed where all of the available water is already being used and an industrial application comes in the door, then they would not be granted a permit because there isn't available water for them to be able to use.
Rob?
So do you think that should be a bit of a factor? Kind of look at, to sustain life for humans and mammals and other individuals. You've got, you need water to consume and drink. You need food production and you need air. You need those kind of three things. So I sort of wonder why are some of the maybe industrial uses or other potential uses for, it could be things, I know you talked about car washes may not be involved, but where that all kind of comes into the equation. So I'm a little concerned at first come, first served to a certain degree, and whether there should be some component in that. So I'm just curious of what your view would be on that. And then I guess my other little question on this is the Watershed Alliances. They obviously represent all the watersheds. You said there's 255 watersheds. There's what, about 70 watershed groups or something like that? I don't know the exact number, but well, whatever. Anyway, so I mean, I get into a little bit of an issue with that presentation that was at the Hernwood School for public consultation, and there really didn't seem to be a lot of watersheds represented at that particular meeting, and kind of made a comment to that. Now, one of the watersheds took exception with that comment in saying that, well, we were actually quite involved in the process of and making presentations. So I just wanted to kind of get confirmation of that, but also your view on usages in comparison to groundwater permits. Where you think the priority should be in that, and should that be involved, or should it be first come, first serve?
So I'll take your latter question first. So yes, there were watershed groups that we talked in depth with and met with. So that, yes, certainly I would say that they were perhaps as well represented in the one-on-one meetings that we had as was industry. If I go back to your other question, that kind of priority is allowed for in the new regulations. Up to date now, we haven't needed to do that. But one of the things is that most of these uses that you're thinking of are more likely to be low capacity wells, and so therefore not needing a permit up till now. That kind of consideration hasn't really come into play. In the future, it does provide an opportunity for looking at that. One of the other things that you'll note in the regulations is there is the ability for the minister to not allocate all the water if he feels that there is a higher and greater use. You'll also see that there's a priority opportunity if not all the water is available based on highest public interest. So that kind of consideration that you're talking about is now going to be doable. And where that will come into play would end up being on a case-by-case basis, because if you look at a lot of things, while it may be said that washing your car is frivolous. Other people would argue that a golf course isn't as frivolous as you would think because there's people that are employed there. So those would be tough decisions to make, but the empowerment is now there for those.
Well, that's where I'm kind of coming from. It seems like, right now the current moratorium is really based on the production of food, and how we would use our water pertaining to that. And yet there's still no really regulations or moratorium on anything to do with how green your greens are in your golf course or for car washes. I'd also probably argue that, and maybe you could shed some light on this, that there probably isn't the perception of how much water is used for irrigation for agricultural purposes may be far less than what people perceive it to be as well. And I think that's where, you need some sound science as it pertains to that. And it would be, in my opinion, that right now there isn't any science pertaining to, not that there isn't, that we're not applying the science that's out there as it pertains to the decisions on where the moratoriums are at now and who gets issued permits. So can you give me a sort of a sense of how many, under these new regulations, how many would be considered high-capacity wells on PEI at the moment, and how many would be pertaining to the use of irrigation for agricultural purposes for food production?
So there's a little over 300 high-capacity wells. There's 35 or 36 high-capacity wells for agricultural irrigation, all pre-existing to the moratorium. And we did a survey last summer of those holding ponds and cluster system. There's 20, if my memory serves, there's 27 holding ponds, and the 5, I believe, low capacity well cluster systems that have the same impact. They just don't utilize a holding pond to buffer their water use. The figure that's up here of the 2% of water used for agricultural irrigation actually includes the existing high-capacity wells for agricultural irrigation and the estimates of water use that we made of the holding ponds. Prior to the holding ponds going in, you're looking at about maybe a little over 1%. Now it's approximately 2%. There's also water being used, surface water. It's not part of this number because it's all groundwater in this figure. And the amount of water that's used in surface water is about another 1% again. So in terms of agricultural irrigation's water use of the total amount of water that we use, very minimal, yes. And the science of the impact that it's having is no different than any other water use in any other well. They use the exact same kind of well that every other high capacity well is. Their impact is not determined by what the water is used for.
Can I just supplement? I'm sorry. Just to follow up on a question prior, I should have mentioned as well. In terms of input of the watershed groups, Mr. Anderson, as Bruce mentioned, many of them were participating in it, but if you look online, Watershed Alliance and many groups have responded as well. And on that same submission page, you'd see the Federation of Agriculture speaks to some of things like this too, in the fairness.
Sure.
I wanted to clarify this in response as well. So if you want to look at the exact wording in the regulations for priority of water usage, as it was mentioned in the presentation, was fire suppression, then domestic water by individual household or through municipal water supply systems. And then third, it's combined industrial, commercial, or other water uses prioritized based on the degree to which the use serves the public interest. So production for food or use of water for food production could be considered as serving the public interest. And that's correct. That's correct. But if you, again, we're in consultations here. We want feedback. So if you think we need to, change the wording on that and make it more explicit, we're always open to recommendations. So thank you for bringing that up.
Michelle?
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for your presentation. So the regulations don't allow any sort of public input or oversight regarding issuing of permits for groundwater exploration for the purpose of digging high-capacity wells or for the withdrawal of the water from high-capacity wells. Why is that?
Just to clarify, so in terms of public input, you're thinking similar to what like an environmental impact assessment?
Yeah, well, I mean, shouldn't the public be part of, or possibly take part of the permitting process? Just
Yeah, sure.
It's a topic that comes up periodically. One of the emphases we wanted to make is that we want to be very objective about issuing permits and base it on the scientific information that's available. Generally speaking, the public aren't equipped to actually partake in those sort of discussions. I mean, certainly in terms of transparency, the information that's brought forward can be public. But in terms of the actual decision, we really believe that should be, rest with the professionals that can evaluate scientific information. And sort of an example throughout periodically, if you've got something where there are kind of rules around how things work, you tend not to go to the public. The formation of the general rule goes to the public, which is kind of where we are here. We don't involve the public in coming up to the speed limits on a particular stretch of highway. We hire professionals to determine what that should be. We as a population would influence what regulations there are for the Highway Act or things like that. So it's kind of a comparable situation. We want to make sure that, again, it's an objective decision, not popular opinion sort of survey that says yes you can because we like what you do, no we can't because we don't like what you do. We want to base it on the environmental impact and on the science. So really that's the key thing. And for something as emotional as this, you can certainly picture how things could be skewed quite far from what a science-based decision would make, just based on popular perception and things like that. So it's not supposed to be a popularity contest, it's supposed to be a scientific decision.
Michelle?
And I would 100% agree with that. I would say that we do give public ability to input on such things as speed limits, for instance, if they feel like the speed limit in their neighborhood is too much. But I do think that the public isn't as possibly educated on our water and our sources of water as they could be. And it is a difficult topic to talk about here in PEI. I've realized that, but everybody cares about whether there's going to be water. We all have a vested interest in our water source. So I've talked to some people in the agriculture industry, and one of the items that they had mentioned was possibly monitoring the water that is being taken out of high-capacity wells or the clustering of wells, because it does come down to science and it does come down to actually knowing what that number is. Like maybe that number is way lower than what the public thinks it is.
It actually is monitored, in fact.
All of them? All of them are
they
monitored?
all are required to have meters and report. I guess Bruce can answer this better than I can. But, and that's been the case for some time. I mean, back probably a decade or so.
Okay.
Yeah, now I might point out that since we've started working on the Water Act, we've hired staff and we make a much more concerted effort to get those numbers, so that we're now still working hard to get those numbers. Where that's going to lead us to is a water registry, which will, is part of the Water Act. And that registry is going to be where people will be able to go and find out how much our water is being utilized, and they'll be able to really understand that those are evidence measured based type values. The same we expect to be true for these low capacity wells. We do envision that they will require meters and monitoring. And again, we anticipate that we will be reporting the amount of water that's being utilized. The Water Registry, we also envision, will complement that water usage information with water in the environment status information. At this point in time, we monitor stream flow and groundwater level, but we don't, it's not all in the sort of easy to find central place. So we're trying to put the water usage, the water status, and reporting all in the same place.
Michelle?
Okay, so just so I can recap that, are all 300 high-capacity wells have flow meters on them? Is that accurate? Am I understanding that answer?
That's our intent. I would have to check with staff to see if they're having trouble with any getting information. There would be some where the information doesn't come from a meter that's right on the well, but comes from a meter that's on their usage equipment, but still a measured number.
Okay.
Michelle?
And is that also the case with so you had mentioned 5 low-capacity clusters, where multiple low-capacity wells are put together and effectively creating a high-capacity well. Is there flow metering on that as well?
Not required because there's no permit required at this point. So when they require a permit, we envision that we will be putting that requirement on their permit. I suspect there are some systems that do have meters on them because the owner wanted that for their own reasons and needs, but they're not required, and we don't have reported volumes for those yet. Just checking.
And there's Brad Trevors here. I just wanted to add, this is why, my goal at the high level is really to get the Water Act proclaimed, so we can make sure that we are measuring, more water usage, including, clusters of low-capacity wells that are acting as high-capacity wells. And I should mention that the inspection of the holding ponds was successful, and there's a full report on that we've just recently published as in the last couple of days onto our website. I know you want to take a look at that, and really it found not to get too deep into that particular inspection report, but and you correct me if I'm wrong here, but there were assumptions made that water was being withdrawn at the maximum capacity of the wells that existed that when the inspection was done, and of all the areas that were looked at, there was only one that in theory might approach the limits for that area. And so we're taking steps to proactively find out exactly what the water usage is, and to make sure that if it is anywhere near that maximum, that we ask the, just in goodwill, working with our farmers that are doing it to reduce the amount of usage. So I thought you'd be very interested in that. Definitely take a look at that report. I'm sure you might have questions on that in the future.
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that. So the Water Registry, is that available publicly?
It will be. It hasn't been built and designed.
Okay.
Michelle?
And when that Water Registry is complete, what will that data do for you? Like, how will you intend to use that data? So, and when I think about that, I'm thinking of different watersheds have different pressures to them. So I'm wondering, when you have all that data in one place, what is your intent with it?
So what it will allow us to do will be to be more precise on when we're assessing new applications coming in. We'll be able to be more precise when we are looking at the impacts of the water that's being used. And we'll be able to be more confident and definitive when telling the public that their water is being managed well and is being put to best use. We hope that it will also give them more confidence that that is the case.
If I could just add to that too, I mean, and I agree. This being it's important to get that information out there, and by having this registry would fulfill one of those important public education and public engagement pieces too.
Michelle?
So when it came to the public consultations, they were all held in October. And can you tell me how you came about choosing the scheduling of those public consultations?
I can take that. Certainly, at the time, we knew with the fall we wanted to engage in the conversation, and I suspect you're referring to the timing of harvest, right? And it is something we heard, quite a bit.
It's very convenient for a lot of people, so that's,
Michelle, yeah.
sorry, Chair, but yes, that's what I'm referring to. So how did you come upon that time frame?
It was again, the importance of getting the information out, and it was the time that allowed us, that was really available with the other schedules that we had, knitting that apart in the fall. But we did have, subsequent meetings with the Federation recognizing that was the case, and that is something we definitely heard, that, perhaps the agriculture voice wasn't as reflected in these numbers as it could be.
I just want to jump in on that. I think that is a valid criticism, that it was at a time when, some farmers couldn't attend because they were still harvesting, in particular potato farmers. We did get a fair turnout at the public consultations, not as much as we could have had, and we heard that from the farmers. My intention was to hold an additional meeting afterwards, closer to Christmas or even in the new year this year. We discussed it and we looked at it, and we talked to the Federation of Agriculture, and we talked to the potato board, and said, do we need to do this? Do you think that you guys have had enough input? And they said, we're okay with it, without you scheduling another consultation. But it's valid criticism. Perhaps another one is needed. If what you're hearing, as agriculture critic, is the potato farmers in particular, or any farmers for that matter, really want another consultation, I mean, I think it's important that we hear the voice of everyone.
Michelle? So the regulations don't define the terms aquifer, recharge, or water table. Can you tell me why that is?
You want that one, George?
Yeah, actually, the answer is fairly straightforward. Those terms are not used in the regulations. And so you would not define something that's not used in the regulations. And so for what we wanted to do in terms of withdrawing water, it was unnecessary to use those terms. And just if you talk to the legislative drafting people, they simply won't put a definition in that is simply for educational purposes and doesn't have a function in the actual regulation.
Okay, thank you.
Chair, I wanted to... Yeah, and along those lines, so, I mean, in the presentation here today, near the beginning, it talks about groundwater recharge. And I sometimes think that there are some misconceptions about what groundwater recharge is. And if the chair and the members think it's a good idea, maybe I could ask the experts here to talk about what groundwater recharge actually is and how that works in our aquifer here on PEI. I don't know, Chair, what you think about members?
Sure, if you'd like. So I guess where to start? Groundwater, I guess, first of all, when you look in the ground below you, it's kind of divided into two zones. If you look at the top zone, you've got sand grains and clays and all that stuff, and little pockets of air and some water. You get below that, all those little pore spaces are fully saturated with water, and that's what is considered groundwater. The geological container for that, or formation, is the aquifer. And the boundary between that saturated zone, where the pore spaces are completely filled with water, and the stuff above it, which is not fully saturated, is the water table. And it moves up and down depending on the relative rate of recharge. In other words, water percolating down to that zone where it's fully saturated, and the rate of discharge. So groundwater is always moving. Much like surface water, it flows according to gravity. So it recharges in one spot and flows to an area of lower elevation. And typically in PEI, that would be a stream or to the coast. The rate of discharge is relatively constant throughout the season. The reason is that the rate of groundwater flow is really dependent on the nature of the rock, which is pretty much fixed in time, we hope, and the gradient, the difference, the height difference, if you will, between where it's recharged and when it's discharged. So that stays pretty constant. The water table does go up and down a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, on the basis of kilometers, only by, say, a meter or something like that. Recharge, on the other hand, does vary quite a bit throughout the seasons. So right now we've got all kinds of water falling, but it's stored. It'll come along with, or melt, along with the regular rains or amount of precipitation you get. So in the spring, the water table is going to rise because the rate of recharge is very much higher than the rate of discharge. When we get into June or July, we're going to find a lot of the precipitation that falls is going to evaporate or be transpired by plants as they start getting active. So as soon as the rate of evaporation and transpiration, called ET, exceeds the rate of recharge, the water table will start to fall. In fact, we will actually, as soon as it gets more than the amount of precipitation, we will stop getting recharge. The exception of long periods of rain or things like that. So there's this sort of normal cycle like that. So recharge is really just the, you can look at it as a quantity or a rate. And if you look at it at a rate, it's the percentage of precipitation that ends up soaking down through the soil to the water table. And usually you look at it on an annual basis because of this up and down part. It doesn't make sense to talk about it for one particular time period within a year. You can also look at it as a quantity. So when we talk about precipitation, we usually talk about an equivalent depth across the land surface. So, you know, they might say we're going to get 20 millimeters of rain. Well, that means a layer of 20 millimeters thick all the way over the land surface. We do the same thing with recharge. So typically in PEI, we would look at something in the range of 350 to 400 millimeters of rain, or sorry, of water, as if you spread it across usually the watersheds that we'd use to look at it. So that's in essence it. It's just this sort of continuous cycle. Just I'll mention real quickly though, one of the relevant things about that is that we, through consultation and this whole discussion, frequently hear people worried about saving water for future generations. And this is one of the reasons why it's a lovely thought, but it's unnecessary, because the water that falls and soaks the water the ground today, regardless of what we do, is going to end up in the ocean in some years or whatever. So we can't actually save it. All we can do is set rules in place so that we don't disrupt that cycle to the point where we create adverse effects.
And I just wanted to add to that, it just to emphasize that key point. What we're talking about here is groundwater recharge. And that's what we're limiting, and that's what we're talking about, the 2.4 trillion liters, and only 35% is allowed to be used. We're not talking about the water in the aquifer, right? This is the water that comes and goes out every year that we're using to manage. So this isn't like, and correct me if I'm wrong here, if I'm getting
no, that's a good point.
But if you look at, you hear about, in California, how they're, or in Mexico City, they're actually tapping into the aquifer. And that's why you see, land that's sinking in this sort of. On PEI, we're not even going near that. We're talking about the groundwater recharge, and that's what we're limiting, and that's what we're using. So there's this idea of saving the water for future generations or depleting our supply. We're only dealing with the water that comes in and out on a yearly basis.
Michelle?
Move on, Chair.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Sorry I was late here, guys. I had the roads were not great from Summerside. So I noticed in the regulations they don't seem to outline any penalties for permitted proponents who waste water that's withdrawn. Why is that?
I can offer a suggestion. Yeah. Certainly, the notion of conservation is an important one, and so we've heard that, and I think we're quite interested in entertaining that in some fashion. One of the difficulties when you talk about even the term conservation or wasting water is it's very subjective, and it may depend a little bit on the setting or industry that you're looking at. So I think the notion makes good sense in terms of the mechanics of how you actually would implement it in an actual regulation. That's a little more difficult.
I might point out, though, that the powers in the regulations for what you would do with a permit, there's no question that the powers are there to review permits, and that's why they go through the review every 5 years. And the concept of being wasteful and efficient is well within the purview of the management of that water. And so while there aren't specific penalties for that, the department and minister has the power to restrict, modify, or amend permits if that is an unfortunate scenario.
Stephen?
Thank you, Chair. So what I'm kind of picking up from what the first answer was that there wouldn't be any way to really enforce such a provision, or it'd be very prohibitive to have that in place ahead of time, as opposed to reacting to a problem?
Yeah, I think the sort of way we would prefer to look at it would be we would not want to approve an approval for withdrawal, which was clearly a wasteful use of water, or there might be a particular industrial process and someone's applying to satisfy that. We'd want to make sure that it's reasonably efficient in how they plan on doing it, and actually have done this in the past in cases. But it's hard to come up with a specific rule, like a summary offense ticket, where you'd say, okay, you're wasting water and we're going to slap you with a $10 fine or whatever. I mean, I'm not quite sure how you would actually do that. It would be much more prudent, I think, to not allow or not approve withdrawal, which would clearly be wasteful in the first place. That's sort of our thinking at this point.
Stephen?
Chair. So I'm no hydrologist or soil expert, but it seems to me the two are quite intertwined in that organic matter is going to hold more water in the soil than depleted soil would. Would that be true?
Yes, absolutely.
Very good. So,
Stephen?
I mean, I've seen some trends in our soil organic matter health here across Prince Edward Island that show it's going down precipitously over the last decade or so here. So would that not mean that these processes are going to require more and more inputs of water as their organic matter declines?
Quite likely the case. I guess the thing I'd draw you back to, though, these regulations are specifically looking at the act of withdrawing water. When we start looking at best practices for agriculture, they're certainly very relevant in terms of all of this stuff, but they're outside the scope of what we're trying to do with these regulations. That's not to dismiss the importance of that, for sure. And certainly it would be prudent for anyone in that area to certainly be examining it closely to minimize their water needs or maximize the benefits of it. But it's outside the scope of what we're looking at. We're simply looking at the environmental impact of withdrawing the water, not getting into the land use issues or the use of water.
And I want to add to that, like if you looked, I think it was on slide 18, it talked about question number 2 at our consultations. You know, this really came up very clearly in the conversations around that. We just get there.
Slowly, surely.
So, you know, do you agree that high capacity wells should be prohibited for agriculture while available for other industries? The discussions that I was privy to, because I was at all the public consultations, were that, you know, it really had to do with agricultural practices of why people say that high capacity wells should be prohibited. You know, we talked a lot about water and the availability of water, and we just heard about the groundwater recharge and this sort of thing. But the main reasons that people were saying we think that high capacity wells should be prohibited for agriculture had to do with the farming practices or perceived farming practices, and to the point of Mr. Henderson and Minister Fox, you know, those really get outside of our area, and you really need to hear from groups like the Federation of Agriculture on that to find out about their best practices and what they're doing in that area and how that relates to irrigation and what they're trying to do. And so, yeah, I mean, I kind of like their suggestions. It's probably a good idea to hear from those groups on that.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So, I mean, we had one answer say that we wouldn't issue a permit if we knew that the water was being wasted, and we know that soil that has low organic matter takes more water, so if you could view that as a waste right there. We also have here that in section 5.4 of the water withdrawal regulations, the minister may consider various environmental factors. I would consider the soil that it might be sprayed upon as one of those factors when determining whether withdrawal of water will have an unacceptable adverse effect. Why may in that situation? Shouldn't it be shall to ensure that all the risks are considered?
You know, what you're pointing out, Mr. Howard, is something that came up quite often, and many submissions really spoke to those two words, right, the use of may versus shall, and you know, I think the intent while drafting was to really have that, make it that we are compelled to look into you know, those pieces. So really, it becomes a matter of you know, recognizing that view is out there and just seeing how the language fits with the legislative drafters.
And just to add to that, one of the groups that we had most intense and lengthy consultations was the Coalition for Protection of PEI Water, who of course are very focused on this issue. And I think, what was there, around 8 hours worth of consultation? And it essentially went through the entire regulations, line by line, word by word, looked at all the maize, all the shells. And this is the first draft of the regulations. Right now, the department's working on a second draft. And I believe that the vast majority of the concerns that were raised are going to be addressed in that second draft with the maize and the shells.
Yeah, for sure. There's a keen interest in getting that corrected where.
So we'll see, but that's where we're at. And what you say is really quite true and valid and interesting, right? Is if you're going to create a well for, you're saying, like irrigation, but it's wasting the water because the practices you're using in whatever sort of, for example, agriculture you're doing aren't good practices, then why should we, approve the permit for that well? And once again, this is actually, that's a conversation we've had with several groups as well, including stakeholders like the Federation of Agriculture, also the Coalition for Protection of PEI Water, and perhaps I think that even came up with the opposition critic. Anyhow, I would encourage you to talk to some of those groups, maybe even as a committee, and see, going forward, what they think of that idea, right? And what sort of things they'd be open for in terms of tying permits for irrigation wells to agricultural practices, that sort of thing. Steve?
Thank you, Chair. There are no real limits on how many wells you can have here, could we have a maximum number of wells that any one stakeholder was allowed to have, or if not, a maximum amount of water that's withdrawn? It just seems like, well, for instance, Summerside and Charlottetown ends up has fewer wells, but has much more of an impact on the local watershed, whereas Summerside has more wells, but has less of an impact and pays twice as much for its fees and permits for such things. So, I mean, some sort of consideration for the actual impact it's having on the local watersheds should be associated with the fees associated with that well, I would expect. You wouldn't want to pay less if you're taking more.
Sorry, are you suggesting that the fees be commensurate to the amount of water that's withdrawn, or?
Yeah, well, it just seems odd that using the Charlottetown Summerside example, that Summerside, who doesn't have much of an impact on its local watershed because it's spread out and distributed, is paying more in fees than Charlottetown would, where they're more centralized and concentrated and having some adverse impacts on the Winter River watershed.
There's a fairly straightforward answer to that, and one of the things we were told frequently as we're drafting these things, when you're looking at fees, that they can't be a tax in essence, that they can't be tied to the amount of water consumed. They need to reflect the level of effort to administer. And so the fees that we have there are meant to reflect the level of effort it requires the department to actually administer that sort of activity. As soon as you start going to sort of a volume-based fee, it would be considered a tax, which we aren't able to, under this fashion, to look at. And I think also it runs that sort of narrow edge that now you're commodifying water. You're putting a price on it. And we want to make sure that the fees we're attached to these permits is really the cost of issuing the permit, not a price on the water.
Thank you, Chair. Just my last question. Yeah, I would agree you don't want to commoditize water, but I guess tied to the environmental impact assessment that would be done with these, would it not be more, when you had a look at that environmental impact assessment, if you had a situation where it looked like you had wells spread out and it was going to have not much of an adverse impact versus some concentrated wells where your math shows you that you're going to take more water out and have that impact, you could reduce your fees for the lower impact wells.
I defer to Bruce on this, but I think you'd have to talk to a hydrogeologist whether assessing the impact of a well that's pumping 200 gallons a minute versus 500 gallons a minute really makes much difference in terms of how much time he spends on this model.
And it's probably not accurate to say that Summerside doesn't have a low impact. Actually, the Summerside Isthmus is heavily utilized because of Summerside's wells, and it doesn't really matter whether those wells are close together or far apart. They still have an impact. So what George was saying is that we've been told that we have to, we really do have to do it solely based upon our costs to administer that withdrawal, and not on the amount of water that's withdrawn.
But more to the point, I think the whole reason for these regulations, right, is if there's going to be a truly negative impact on a watershed, like what we saw with the Winter River when, during the summer it was drying up because we were using too much of the groundwater recharge with the water withdrawal. We're not going to allow that water withdrawal to occur, right? That's the whole point there. And so, we're already seeing it with the Charlottetown and where they're putting in the new high-capacity well fields outside of the Winter River watershed to reduce the impact there. And this summer, for the first time in a long time, the Winter River did not dry up because these rules are being taken into account and we're forcing them. And these regulations and the Water Act as a whole will, even as we continue to get into the water management areas, will allow us to permit and regulate so that we don't have those adverse impacts. And it's not so much about trying to charge somebody because they're having a bigger impact than another. We're making sure that overall there will be there won't be a negative impact. That's where we want to get to. We know how much water we have in groundwater recharge, and we want to make sure that we don't go above the limits, so we don't have those negative impacts.
Just one last quick comment that ties to the may and shall comments on the environmental assessments there, I guess. So as long as that's a shall instead of a may, we should be good.
Right.
Peter?
Oh, thank you, Chair. Firstly, I want to thank you for your presentation this morning, and I know the hundreds and hundreds of hours that have gone into both the preparation of the Act a couple of years ago and now the regulations. And I also want to thank all of the people who did come out. You've already done that. But specifically the 8 hours I think you mentioned of specific consultation you had with the PEI Coalition for the Protection of Water, and thank them for their public advocacy and the amount of work and time that they have put in to really digging down, as you said, line by line in these regulations and doing a lot of work on behalf of the many, many islanders who recognize that water is something that's absolutely fundamental to the well-being of our society, and all the farmers and the other people who came forward. So thank you for that, and thank them for that. One quick question to start off with. I see that geothermal up there had a fairly significant, certainly compared to agricultural irrigation, for example, it was many times more. That really surprised me, given that I at one time owned a geothermal system here and it was considered an oddity. And obviously this wouldn't be a closed loop system, we're talking about a pump and dump system here, but where are all of these geothermal heating systems that are contributing that much water use?
A large part of them would probably be right in Charlottetown, larger, like the Holman Hotel, things like that. So when you look at the volumes, they may be pumping a couple hundred gallons a minute as opposed to, say, 10 or 15 gallons a minute you might for a household thing. So certainly the industrial commercial sector would be the largest portion, I would expect. And Bruce probably would have a better sense of it, but I would think that would be the case.
There is that, and also the other thing is only when you would know yourself that they pump continuously high volumes of water.
True. Yeah.
And so that the impact of any one of these wells is not necessarily the high volume of water that they're putting, is the net volume of water that they're withdrawing. And then it may be common in other places where the dump part is of the system is to the surface or the stream. It's very rare in PEI. Mostly in PEI, the dump part is back into an injection well. So they have a very little impact in terms of volume for the volume that you see up there being utilized.
Peter? Thank you, which was what I assume, because of that, as you say, dumping back directly into the system and usually very close to where the exit pump is. There's been a lot of talk this morning about high capacity wells, sometimes misnamed as deep water wells, and I'm wondering if trying to relate these two together, do you have any data on what the average depth of the current high-capacity wells that are actually being used across the island are? What the average depth or what the range of depths is?
We've never calculated an average depth, so I wouldn't be able to give you that figure, but a range of these, you're looking at 60 to 100 meters in terms of what their typical depth would be. And their typical depth is approximately a little bit deeper than the typical depth for a domestic system. Similar construction though, that they are an open borehole. No fancy other components down there that you might find in other places. The difference is that typically the diameter is bigger. And another important consideration is that a lot of people always assume that the deeper the well, the deeper the water that the well is utilizing. And certainly correct me if I get any of this wrong, George, but where I'm going is that the water that's being utilized and going into and getting pumped out of a high-capacity well is very similar to the water that would come out of an everyday ordinary domestic well. Because of the way water gets into the well, most of that water is coming from the upper part of the water table, irrespective of how deep that well is. The deeper parts of that well, the water flow into the well is less, transmissivity is less, so that the water source for both styles of wells is approximately the same.
Peter? Did George want to add anything?
No, that's absolutely right. The permeability in the rock is much higher in the shallow levels. Rock's more weathered and things like that. So the vast majority comes in the top of the well. Now, occasionally you'll hit a nice big fracture at some depth or whatever. And it's one of the reasons that most wells aren't much more than 60 to 100 meters deep, because you're better off drilling a second well. If you keep on drilling deeper, you might get lucky and hit a nice great fracture, but chances are you're not going to add much to the well yield. So absolutely right. The deep water wells is kind of a misnomer. They may be deep partly because as you start pumping, you draw the water down and you need enough room to have a pump low enough to accommodate that. But most of the water, and there have been hydraulic profiles that will show this, that the permeability decreases as you go down. The well yield per foot of well drops as you go deeper.
Peter? Thanks, George, and you've led perfectly into what the question I was going to ask, and I know the study you did back in 2007 with Martin Savard looked at that varying permeability as one goes deeper down. And so my questions surround, we've talked a lot about recharge and how that is an annual cycle, or at least that's how it's described, or how you described it, George, and it was very compelling and it was very useful, I think. But when we're getting down to the lower depths, where of course the residency of the water there is not something that changes on an annual basis. And some of the studies from that study that you did back in 2007, water at a depth of 60 to 100 meters, which you've just described for these high capacity wells, the residency there is not measured in a year or a number of years, but it's thousands of years, 5,000, or at least that's what I read in your report.
Yeah, actually not quite thousands, but yes, much older certainly. Yeah.
5,000 to 7,000 years below 36 meters and above 100 is what I read in your report.
Some of the water would be, if you look at the average residence time, it's not quite that old, but it's true. It is almost stagnant. It's hardly moving, and so it is very much older yet.
Sure. And Peter, sorry, Chair, thank you. So regardless of that, the point I'm trying to make here is that when we're talking about recharge, we're talking about a very superficial layer of the groundwater that we have here on Prince Edward Island, rather than this deeper layer, which is being accessed by, despite, well, maybe I'm slightly misunderstood what you said, Bruce, but you drill a well to 60 meters, but the water that you're getting is not necessarily from 60 meters. It might be from higher up in that well shaft.
Mm-hmm. If you look at, again, from the same set of studies, you probably heard Yifeng Yang talk on various occasions as well. From his modeling, he's estimating 80% of the discharge from that, and it should be exactly the same site, would occur in the first 22 meters. the actual. So while there is some water there that's fairly old, and most of it, the average residence time, you could debate exactly what it is, but the bottom line is when you get down to those lower depths, it's fairly stagnant movement. The residence time for water for most domestic wells, I think, was estimated to be about 22 years, something like that. For the top 10 meters, or I can't remember the exact figures now, it's quite a long time ago, was perhaps 4 years. So you're absolutely right. It's not, we're not using this year's water always. Now, some portion of it is. So we looked at wells, we were specifically looking at nitrate, but we had a technique where we could identify when the nitrate was formed and solving the water. And at shallow depths, we could actually see seasonal trends. So we knew the water was recharged within the last 3 or 4 months. As you go a little deeper, you'd see mixtures of it. So probably 3 or 4 years old. As you go deeper, the average age. So again, some of it's going to be fairly new, some of it's going to be fairly old. The vast majority of it's flowing more or less horizontally because that's where the fractures go. And so really, most of the action's in the top 20 to 30 meters. So it's not just this, 400 millimeters of water that we're getting annually. We're looking at a mixture of stuff. Stuff's going sort of into a tank. Some's leaking way down. It's essentially inaccessible. Some of it's reasonably accessible. That's usually this, top 100 feet or 150 feet, something that range.
But the thing to keep in the back of your mind is to remember that there is, it's not just how old the water is that you're pulling out. In other words, how long it's been down in the ground. It's to look at the net annual flow. In other words, the water that's entering by recharge and leaving by discharge, you want to make sure that those values lead you to sustainable management. And on PEI, unlike other places in the world that the minister alluded to, we have never utilized any more than about half of the water that's coming in, so that the sustainability of the groundwater for PEI is extremely high. You would, in order to be unsustainable, you would have to be withdrawing on a net basis more water than is being recharged. It's like taking money out of the bank. If you've got $100 going in every month and you're taking out 150, it's not how long that $1 spent there, it's the fact that you're taking out too much. And so with our recharge, we've never taken over 50%, and the more protective policy that we put in a decade ago is actually now at 35% approximately, so that we are taking much less than the amount of water that's going in, which places us in an extremely good position in terms of sustainability.
Might just add also just briefly, so when you look at the deeper stuff, the water that's, depending on the technique, more than 100 years old, whatever, if you remove a pint of that water, pump it out of a well, mixed with all the other stuff, it's being replaced by other water that's like 5 years younger than it. So you're not leaving this gap, this hole of all this water we've saved over the last 10,000 years or whatever. It's, again, part of the cycle. It's just that part of the cycle is moving much more slowly. But when you remove it, it's immediately replaced by the water that's sort of just above it and moving around the flow system. So you're not actually mining or depleting that resource. You're renewing the age of it, I guess, if you will, at most. But it's not actually diminishing the water at depth.
Say something, Brian?
I'm good.
Peter, how many questions do you have left? We're getting short on time, but I don't want to cut anyone off.
Right, well, we're going to, aren't we? Because we're 10 to 1. Yeah, I mean, we can speak privately or, afterwards about this. I do have a number of other questions. Can I follow on? Because Robert and I were both at an agricultural event yesterday at Red Shores, and a lot of talk amongst the farmers. Can I ask one more question, Chair?
Sure.
And then regarding management of water on their farms and the many challenges that the potato farmers are having. It was a potato board event. And there was one of the presentations I saw was on putting tile in to actually remove water from the land in order to make it more workable. But one of the concerns, and Adam Fennick was there from the university, and he talked about the the future variability of water flow patterns here and rainfall patterns on Prince Edward Island. And that sort of summer drought, fall deluge that we seem to already be moving towards. And I'm wondering whether you can talk to, and you've already spoken a little bit about that seasonal variability and how that impacts the water table. But obviously the time when farmers are going to need this irrigation is when we're in a drought. So they don't need it if we have lots of water, rainfall in July and August. So at the time where we are most vulnerable, that's when the water is needed. Are there any reports or any studies out there to show that the potential removal of water at that time would have a negative impact on other ecosystems, rivers, streams, tributaries in the area?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Got to keep your timeline in mind. This could be a long answer.
I realize it's a complex question.
We have looked at the impact of climate change. We have yet to publish the results of that, but one of the important components of it is that it shows that based on current estimates of rainfall and the changes in patterns of rainfall and the changes in temperature, and that the work that we've done shows that the changes in temperature in the wintertime are going to be particularly important because that changes that interim storage. In other words, more rain, less snow. What we're going to end up seeing is that the total amount of recharge, all of those various pluses and minus factors factoring in, the total amount of recharge is not going to change dramatically. What will change in important ways is the seasonal patterns of it. We will see our spring recharge occurring earlier in the year and our fall recharge occurring later in the year. We will have less recharge for a longer period of time. And that could lead one to be concerned about stream flows. We've looked at how that would translate into stream flows and find that it will have, during the summer period, our base flow, groundwater component of that will remain very little changed. Slight decreases, if you will. Now, the surface story of the land for farmers, I think it seems like those predictions are going to change their world fairly dramatically. And that's because the water that they're heavily using is in that root zone. It just fell out of the sky last week, right? Groundwater, much longer averaging system, and that's why it will be pretty fine. That's not to diminish the impact that the agricultural sector is going to have, and what I think we're hearing from them is that the impacts on them in that shallow root zone is going to be why their demand and desire for water is going to grow. Because they are going to have to deal with longer, drier periods that well users, all of us, are going to be dramatically affected by because there will still be lots of water down there.
Chair, I realize that I'm not going to get to many of my questions, and I suspect neither the other members. Can I suggest that we ask that the presenters come back at another day if they're amenable to that? I'm not saying cut it off now, but I'm not going to get to some of the important questions I have. Would it be possible to set another date to continue this conversation?
Something we discuss now.
Well, it's up to the chair and the committee. If you folks want, you can set it as a point for discussion, either right this minute to see if there's a consensus, or as an item for consideration at the next meeting. Right now, we don't have a specifically scheduled meeting on the books.
Can we discuss?
Can we just do a motion?
Yeah, we could discuss that in new business and move through what remains of the questions now.
Do we want to discuss it once we get to new business or the work plan? Is that?
Well,
That's fine.
yeah, I think we've got 5
Yeah.
minutes, right?
We're gonna
Because we
get
have a
through the whole
hard stop
agenda,
here,
but-
so,
yeah.
yeah.
Is that, we're good for now, I guess? All right, okay, well, I appreciate it, and I know we're short on time, so, you know, perhaps if you are willing to come back in at another date in the near future, that would be appreciated.
Well, I just, thank you so much to the committee for having us in. I know one of the reasons we're in is we sent the draft regulations as per the Water Act. Any changes to regulations need to go to the committee 90 days before we can bring them forward in an order in council. And we're going to do the same thing with the new draft of regulations. I think it's taking a little longer than I really wanted it to as minister, but I think in general, from what I've heard from people, they'd rather get it right than get it right now, as it were, and so that's where we're going with this. So thanks to the committee, and thanks, of course, to the great staff, Environment, Water, and Climate Change. Pretty lucky minister. Thank you.
Jamie? Jamie?
Thanks, Chair. Listening to everything that everybody said today between Robert and Peter, Michelle, and Steve and myself, what I'd like to see, if we're going to bring this topic back, which I think we should, but I think we need to have two things I'm interested in. Number one is, what's going to be our best practices going forward to get the research that we need to know across all sectors that are using our water. So what type of research can we be put in place, but also how can we engage industry more so they're part more of the conversation and the work that's going forward. Because I think industry is very important to this, that we know, where is actually industry going down the road with best practices to deal with situations that are arising because of climate change. So, I'm hearing you, and I understand what you're saying about, our seasons are changing. There's no question about that, right? So how do we look at research around that and how that applies to industry, and then bringing industry to the table on the whole conversation? I don't think it can be a conversation of just 200 people if it does not completely involve industry. So industry has to have some buy-in of this and be part of the process going forward. Thank you.
Perfect, all right, we're going to recess momentarily. All right, I'll just call the meeting back to order. Next on the agenda is review of correspondence and work plan. It's just that one sheet there we have. It's not a very long list. So we have the briefing. Okay, so what we just went, the presentation we just had, and we had a point brought up that we would perhaps like to see them come in at a later date again. Well, not a late, but as soon as they can. Is there consensus in the committee for that? Because I don't think everyone got to their questions, and I had some as well that I was going to have to scratch, so that's okay. Perfect, so we have consensus for that. The other three items we have are briefing on land transactions under Business Corporations Act and transparency of PEI business/corporate registry. Have we heard back from, has a letter been sent?
For which one, sorry?
The briefing on draft, or sorry, the briefing
Business
on land.
corporations, I believe that's gone out, but I'm not aware of a response. Basically, all three of the other topics that are mentioned there that don't have dates attached to them, either something's gone out and we haven't heard, or stuff's just been going out recently, so we wouldn't have heard back yet anyhow. That being the case, I don't know if the committee might want to prioritize having our Water Act-related guests back in as soon as possible versus the other items. If that sounds okay to folks, and if there's consensus on that, we can maybe make sure that's the next thing we do and keep pursuing the rest of it after that, if that sounds good to people.
Consensus on that? Yeah.
Well,
Steve?
I'm not even sure if I'm actually sitting on this committee at the moment or not. But as long as there's not a long timeline before they can come back so that the committee remains inactive, I'd just like to throw that in there.
Good. All right. Okay, so we'll go with that, and then I guess the other items we can, well, once we hear
Come back to,
we
yeah.
can plan that. All right. Any more discussion on the work plan? No? New business? All good? All right, motion to adjourn?
Adjourn.
All right.